New genres of music can completely redefine a society. For the first half of the 20th century, jazz was the defining music. Jazz has evolved since its birth in New Orleans, and American culture has advanced with it. Black artists in New Orleans mixed blues, ragtime, and other musical genres to form a new style. It was a new kind of music that brought about new ideas. Jazz would come to change the morals of the American people. Jazz was born around the turn of the 20th century. It was rooted in older music that was popular in New Orleans, mainly ragtime, the blues, and spirituals. There are also echoes of traditional African drumming and classical European music. Historians and musicians still argue over who invented jazz, whites or blacks, but the truth is, no one group created it. Many immigrants were coming to New Orleans, mainly from Africa or Europe. Ragtime originated from a practice of African Americans ragging traditional European tunes, syncopating and bopping them until they were lively and danceable. Eventually, after ragtime mixed with the blues and became more soulful, jazz was born. Jazz became the city's personal music, but it wasn't popular nationwide. That would all change after World War I. The steady flow of European immigrants who labored in factories was slowing to a trickle. So industrial managers traveled to the South, looking for others who would work for fairly low pay, blacks. Factory owners panicked and raised the wages of all who would work, until this factory work paid a lot more than farming. By 1930, 2 million African Americans had left the dusty South for the cities of the North. The 1920s were a period when morals were shifting and Americans were rethinking age-old ideas about race, gender, and society. The first major defining event of 1920s America began on January 17, 1920, Prohibition. Prohibition had the opposite effect that was intended. In New York City, there were an estimated 30,000 to 100,000 speakeasies. Many jazz musicians got work in speakeasies. The 1920s were known as the Jazz Age. There was a general feeling of mutiny against not just the government, but families as well. For young women, this meant doing things they never had before, drinking, getting jobs, and standing up for themselves. The flapper culture had begun. Jazz was a way for women to loosen up and disregard society's expectations. Women became independent and took the first step towards equal rights. Jazz opened up many performing careers for women. Before the 1920s, music was almost always performed by men. Now, women could get jobs on Broadway, the radio, and jazz clubs. Advertisements began to be targeted towards young women in a less sexist way. Many of these ads were targeting jazz babies or flappers. Many had to do with jazz, like dancing clothes, music, and instruments. In the 1920s, there were many female jazz singers who worked with male instrumentalists. Female jazz instrumentalists normally joined all-female bands, as male bands rarely accepted females who played anything other than piano. But while youth and women thrived under jazz, the earlier generation believed that jazz was a sign that America was becoming immoral. They thought it wasn't proper music, just noise and chaos. They also didn't respect the black musicians responsible for jazz. Racially integrated bands still weren't allowed. Also, a type of record called a race record started to be marketed. Race records were directed towards African Americans, but not in a positive way. The music featured on these records was stereotypically African. These race records were marketed as being beneficial to the national black community, so many bought these records to support their race. Bessie Smith's records were so popular, she was cast in a sound movie. Finally, the record companies realized how popular these race records were, and started trying to sell them to white audiences. But many of the record company owners took advantage of their black clients, leading many to believe that whites were stealing jazz. However, the new generation of Americans was becoming slowly more racially accepting. They respected African Americans for their musical innovations. In the late 20s, the nation's wealth had doubled, cities were growing, and minorities were working their way towards equal rights. Women had the right to vote. Just as the 20s had begun with Prohibition, it ended on October 29, 1929 with the stock market crash. Suddenly, many found themselves short on money. The culture of the 1920s screeched to a halt as people stopped paying for entertainment. Jazz looked like it could finally die out, but many jazz musicians decided to share their art for free. A new type of jazz called swing emerged. Swing was optimistic and peppy, and it cheered people up. Lots of people loved and bought swing. It completely saved the recording industry. Dancing was popular again. Swing became the music of the 30s. Some even call the 30s the swing age. It continued to work away at racism. Great musicians like Duke Ellington and Louis Armstrong gained fame, but people continued to listen to swing. Somehow, they took out the little money they had to go out and be happy. On that note, the 1930s came to a close, but trouble was brewing again. When Duke Ellington went on tour in Europe in the spring of 1939, he was greeted with open arms. Everywhere he went, he and his band were admired and treated well, better than in America. Europeans seemed to think nothing of the performer's races. The band loved Europe, but when they tried to cross Germany, they weren't allowed to even enter the country. Black foreigners had been banned, as well as jazz. Back on the home front, civil rights was emerging. In a letter written from Louis Armstrong to a jazz critic, Armstrong said, "I'd like to recall one of my most inspiring moments. I was playing a concert date in a Miami auditorium. I walked on stage, and there I saw something I'd never seen. I saw thousands of people, colored in white, on the main floor. Not segregated in one row of whites and another row of Negroes, just all together, naturally. I thought I was in the wrong state. When you see things like that, you know you're going forward. Women took over in workplaces after men were drafted, and they also took over in music. Many female jazz musicians had opportunities that they hadn't had with the competition of men. And indeed, it appeared that America was going forward. But this wasn't entirely true. African Americans were angry. After World War I, they had been ignored for their wartime efforts and didn't want to be dismissed again. Many were drafted to serve in World War II, including musicians. The military let more white musicians into the military band than black musicians. To black musicians, the real enemy wasn't the Germans. It was the white Americans who continually disrespected them, their place in society, and their music. The Nazis hadn't warmed up to jazz, just the opposite. Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's propaganda minister, banned jazz and swing. In the spirit of jazz, people ignored him. Eventually, even the word jazz was banned, but there are ways around that. For example, in Belgium, the Hot Jazz Club changed its name to the Rhythmic Club and continued to play jazz. In occupied France, where all American music was banned, French artists simply changed the titles of their favorite songs to French and kept playing. A year after the ban, Goebbels accepted that jazz wasn't going away. Instead, he hired a swing band that he played on the radio, with the original lyrics changed to support his cause. Another one of the Nazis' tactics was to make a movie to show the world how kind they were to the Jews. A concentration camp, Terezin, was the stage for this play. They dressed up all of the occupants to make them look nice. They showed jazz musicians, a band called the Ghetto Swingers, playing for and supposedly entertaining the prisoners. Once the movie was over, the Ghetto Swingers were sent to Auschwitz. There was another very different group of Europeans who loved jazz music, teenagers in Germany called swing kids. They loved jazz and they broke many rules to have meetings, play records, and listen to jazz radio. Many youth supported America in the war because of jazz music. You won't be able to understand this because you were born in America, but to us, jazz is some kind of religion. We really had to fight for it, and I remember nights when we didn't go down to the bomb shelter because we listened to jazz records. We just had the feeling that you were not our enemies, and even though the bombs crashed around us, we felt safe, said jazz pianist Yetta Hip. Swing kids came up with their own dress and fashion styles to distinguish themselves from Nazi culture. The 1940s provided new outlets for jazz, but the popularity of jazz was coming to a close in America. In the late 40s, early 50s, jazz became more of an art form than an entertainment. It was more of an edgy music than a dance music and more for music enthusiasts. But its effect on civil rights hadn't been forgotten. Charles Black, a white lawyer who sided with Thurgood Marshall and was instrumental in the Brown versus the Board of Education case, told his story. Louis Armstrong was the first genius I had ever seen, Black wrote in the Yale Law Journal. It is impossible to overstate the significance of a 16-year-old Southern boy seeing genius for the first time in a black. We literally never saw a black then in any but a servant's capacity. It was just then that I started towards the Brown case where I belonged. But a new style of music was slowly gaining popularity. This was a different, later form of jazz, also derived from black music. This new style was called rock. By 1960, jazz was still the most popular music around, but its popularity had drastically declined. What happened? One possible answer is that jazz was moving away from its origins of dancing and fun and made its way to being more technical and less danceable. Maybe rock was just what people wanted in the 60s. Or maybe America got tired of the jazz music that it had so defined it for decades. Many jazz musicians left the US for Europe, where they were better appreciated. Jazz's impact on racial relations pushed the civil rights movement, which would define the 60s. But jazz splintered in so many directions that it was hard to tell what it was anymore. Many young musicians wanted to participate in the new types of jazz, but older musicians were not so optimistic. They were tired of the white people controlling and manipulating their industry, while the African Americans had trouble getting jobs, and at that point still hadn't earned their rights. Young musicians were intent on getting these rights and decided to do so through their music. Their form of jazz became angry and driven not by the want to entertain, but the want to anger. They wanted to reclaim jazz and return it to its African roots. They wanted to eradicate any European influences, even though that too was a critical part of jazz from the beginning. Many of the younger ones wanted to be as popular as the rock musicians. Miles Davis was the first major jazz musician to assimilate to rock. He made an album, Bitches Brew, a mixture of jazz and rock. It was wildly successful, and his later albums got progressively more rock-like. I never thought jazz was meant to be a museum piece like other dead things once considered artistic. Jazz was one of the most influential forces in the 20th century. Its impact on employment, equal rights, and culture has changed America. Jazz has always been about being accepting and opening up to new things. As Duke Ellington said, jazz is a good barometer of freedom. In its beginnings, the United States of America spawned certain ideals of freedom and independence through which eventually jazz was evolved. And the music is so free that many people say it is the only unhampered, unhindered expression of complete freedom yet produced in this country.